the time will come up when the wind will stop and the breeze will cease to be breathing. Like a stillness in the wind, for the hurricane begins, the hour that the ship comes in. Oh, the seas will split and the ship will hit, and the sand on the shoreline will be shaken, and the tide will sound and the waves will hound, and the morning will be breaking.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Left and Lefter. It's been a minute. I'm Brett, and I'm left.
And I'm Alice, and I'm Lefter. We're sorry for the hiatus, but things happened, and there's not much you can do about that. But we're back, hopefully on a more regular schedule now that it's the summer. For today, we've got some interesting topics. They're kind of disconnected from each other, but I think it's going to be a good episode. So, Brett, why don't you lead us into our first topic?
So we're breaking a little bit from what we typically talk about, which is just directly talking about politics and public events. And we're going to talk about a bad movie, Avengers Infinity War. I think let's do what we can first without spoiling it. We're going to have to get into spoilers pretty quickly, but we'll warn people when we do. So, for a minute first, before we get into spoilers, just what was your general impression of the movie?
Right. So it's a really, really mixed bag, honestly. And a lot of the Marvel movies are. I think part of what has made the Marvel movies popular is their general tone, which tends to skew more towards fun superhero romps than, for example, DC, which has tried to do more serious sort of
DC
creative
thinks
ethos.
That you can entertain people by just making them miserable.
Yeah, and that's kind of amusing to me, because historically, when the DC and Marvel rivalry was at its most extreme, which was in the 60s, and during the Silver Age of comics, it was DC that was doing a lot of sort of silly and sort of campy stories. Like, had imaginary stories where Superman adopted Jimmy Olsen as his son, and meanwhile Marvel was breaking a lot of ground with a lot more grounded and sort of serious and sort of introspective heroes. You couldn't go one issue of Spider-Man without Peter Parker feeling miserable about himself and wanting to quit being Spider-Man because of some issue in his personal life. And you had the Fantastic Four, who were family and they bickered and fought and everything. But now in the modern age, it's kind of reversed, and now Marvel is doing a lot more fun and sort of silly stuff, while DC is very much stuck in this just very gritty mindset. But I think that can backfire a lot, especially when you have a movie like Infinity War, which wants to be a very epic, galaxy-spanning event movie. But it still feels like it has to, because it's a Marvel movie now, and this is what they've become known for, have these sorts of sillier and lighter moments, which I've talked about this before, but Marvel movies have this weird talent for having lines and comedic beats that are genuinely very funny, but have no reason to exist in the scenes in which they exist. I think Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a very good example of this. In the final battle, with Ego, the Living Planet, who's the main character, Peter Quill's father, both Ego and Peter surround themselves in rocks and have a giant rock person battle, and Peter turns into Pac-Man and like you have the sound effect from Pac-Man playing, and it completely ruins the mood. So it's and that was a problem with Infinity War too. You had these very good dramatic scenes, and you had these very good, very very funny lines, but they just stuck them together.
So that's actually that's one of the things that I didn't mind about the movie, honestly. I think Marvel, like, you're right that like they insert these sort of like witty, light lines, and like very serious moments, but they do it in a way that I honestly feel like they pull it off. It like keeps it lighthearted while still keeping you invested in the action. That's actually one of the things that I didn't have as much of a problem with the movie with. That's like the standard Marvel formula that like if you like Marvel movies, you're gonna like it in this one too. And everyone enjoys a bit of that. And so like if you're really a huge fan of that sort of like dialogue formula, you're gonna like this movie. Just like, you know. Mm-hmm. And I mean it's got some good action scenes that you expect from Marvel movies in it. The Wakanda scenes were the only ones that really like were really incredible. But like if you would, I was going to say like, I mean this is pretty typical from Marvel movies. Is just that the action sequences were very good. They're always very well choreographed. But they do fall into these same patterns of like a bunch of minions and they're basically there for the actors who get paid less than the main ones to fight. It was sort of the same thing with like Age of Ultron, where you know it's like the exact same setup where it's like we have millions of very weak creatures all over the city. We all got to take care of them. But in this case, in the Wakanda scene, I actually thought it was they did a cool job with it because like the creature design for the things they were fighting was cool. Where like they talked about this in Red Letter Media's review, and I thought that they were right about it. They're critics I follow a lot, where it's like it seemed more menacing, like they had like a pathos to them because they were like sacrificing themselves and just to get in the shield. Yeah, so it was actually creepy.
And a couple and a couple of other things that made that scene work more than I think Age of Ultron is a very good example. Because unlike in Age of Ultron, there were first of all like several different like variations on the sort of minions. Like in Age of Ultron, it was all just like Ultron clones, which pretty much were the same thing. And in this battle, you had those big giant tanks. You had like the standard sort of monsters, and you had the like the underbosses of Thanos' space gang, as it were, and also like the heroes like were very clearly losing until like Thor showed up. I thought that was interesting. Like it was sort of a subversive setup where you had this giant army with all of almost every single Marvel hero, and then they almost immediately just were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And then in the previous Avengers movie, they struggled a bit, but there was always it was always at least even, I feel, and it was very clear that until Thor showed up, this was not something that they were going to be able to handle.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the and this was very intentional on their part. It's sort of one of the ways that the new Avengers movie breaks from the last one. Which is that you go into it not expecting the good guys to win in the end. Because in Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron and in Civil War, which is effectively an Avengers movie, you knew that like by the end of the movie they're going to resolve it. You know, it's the Avengers. You go there for 2 hours of entertainment and then you leave and forget about it. But they sort of set this one up intentionally that like this is the beginning of the ultimate Avengers tale. So you go into it less confident that like they're actually going to win, which like that was what they were aiming for. But honestly, it didn't really do much for me because it was like, even if they're not going to win at the end of this movie, I know that they're going to like, it's a happy ending at the end of the franchise. Like Marvel isn't gonna Okay, so I suppose that we've given a rough outline of our thoughts about the movie. I agree, it's a mixed bag. I give it 5 out of 10. We're trying to get into...
I feel like that's pretty fair, yeah.
We're going to get into spoiler territories here because we want to talk about a couple of things about the movie. For one, so spoilers from here on out. We try to avoid it as long as we could.
Right.
But, so we wanted to talk about a couple of different things, which is, for one, Thanos' motivations. And then also, I wanted to talk a bit about the franchise itself and what this sort of says for film,
right?
Where film is in like a AAA big budget level. But first, we wanted to shit talk the politics of the movie because there's a lot of shit talking to be done here.
Yes. And if you allow me, I feel like I'd like to. So basically, Thanos' motivations, which are changed from the comics, because in the comics he's just very much a genocidal maniac who wants to kill untold amounts of people because he's in love. He's literally in love with death as in a concept. But in the film, they've changed it so that Thanos views the galaxy, the universe, as unbalanced, because the way he sees it, there will always be not enough resources and too many mouths. And so his goal is to use the Infinity Stones, which are like these huge, powerful artifacts that were formed at the beginning of the universe, gather them all together and use their power to wipe out exactly half of all life in the universe. And his reasoning is that with half of the universe dead, there will be more resources to go around for everyone. And of course, this is basically a philosophical school of thought called Malthusianism, which points to the largest problem facing humanity as an excessive population.
Yeah. So it's
and it's very wrong, but
it's this old philosophical idea laid out by a very famous classical economist named Malthus. And his idea was essentially that population growth is going to grow at a much faster rate and climbing rate, much faster increasing rate than food production can. And thus that we're going to enter at some point a catastrophe where we have mass starvation and disease and war on account of the fact that we have just so many more people than resources to handle that number of people. And this has been a pretty influential idea throughout history. In most recent years, especially within the last, I'm going to say 75, 80 years, the idea has come under heavy criticism and has largely been dismissed by a lot of different people, economists, political thinkers, and so on, for a variety of different reasons. But
the problem is, of course, that while it is academically, it has been thoroughly discredited, in popular culture and the popular consciousness, it still holds a lot of influence because it feels like it should be right.
Yeah.
And, there's a certain amount of logic to it. Like, obviously, at some point there's going to be not enough resources to go around, but and so you see a lot of, especially science fiction stories, you see this these dystopian futures, Soylent Green is a very good example of this, where overpopulation and dwindling resources have caused catastrophe. The Fallout universe the reason there was a nuclear war in the Fallout universe is because of a lack of material resources. In that case, like oil and gas, which is somewhat more feasible, I feel, than food. But it still plays this idea of the conflict between population and resources being a central problem.
There's an intuitive logic to it, where it seems like something that makes sense, right? That it's population growth is exponential because as there are more people have kids, and as there are more kids, those people become more people and have more kids, and it's exponential.
There's a song, an old folk song about it. It says we'll all be a Dublin, a Dublin, a Dublin. We'll all be a Dublin in 32 years. And it just exponentially grows in terms of how many people there are.
So there's
and the problem, of course, is that it isn't as simple as just a math.
So there's a couple of different problems here. For one thing, population growth on Earth is sooner than later. I mean, like within the next 50 years, is going to start leveling off. Like we're not at the point of exponential growth right now. The growth rate is in such a I don't have the numbers and data in front of me, but if you look this up, the UN has published all the data on it. We're not at a point of exponential population growth. We're at a point that we're going to start seeing declining population growth rates fairly soon into the future, and then we're going to hit a peak at some point. So for one thing, just the basic idea of we can't have more people is sort of not really relevant, because with the emergence of for one thing, for the emergence of contraception, for the emergence of family planning, and for the fact that birth rates tend to decline as income does, we're going to slowly start seeing even very low income areas start to see declining birth rates, like sub-Saharan Africa. So overpopulation isn't really going to be too much of a mathematical problem. It's never going to become an infinite growth scenario. Right. And then also at the same time, we're going to have, assuming that productivity growth continues in agriculture, we're going to see more and more food being produced, perhaps eventually at a faster rate than population growth is. So it underestimates technological improvements on growing food, and it overestimates the problem of exponential growth of people. And that's essentially what's wrong with the idea. But there's a deeper logic here in the movie that I think is worth of criticism, which is the fact that Thanos, so he gets these 5 stones, that's the whole point of the movie, so that he could do this, and he sees himself as the arbiter who's going to wipe out half of the human population once he gets these, or wipe out half of life on Earth, or life on the universe. And then once he does that, things are going to be stable for a while, and then in a couple eons or whatever, he's going to have to do it again. And he's the guy who keeps the balance there. If he has the ability to control time and reality, he could just create infinite food. The entire logic here is driven he's taken on this tragic position where he sees himself as this authority, and he does this thing not because he has this love for death like he did in the comics, but because he sees himself as having this moral responsibility. That's bullshit. You have the ability to provide everyone with... You literally have a post-scarcity machine in your hand. You could end all economic scarcity with that. And but they never even mention that once, or even discuss the idea of it. His solution is just genocide of half the people by random choice.
Mm-hmm. And that was another thing, that because the line he did give him is when he was discussing because his whole background is his planet Titan was facing this sort of supposed problem, and his solution was to basically create a randomized genocide machine that would, in his own words, kill indiscriminately rich and poor alike. And right there in that line, you have the actual problem.
Yeah.
That there being a stratification and a difference in access and ability to access food and resources between rich and poor.
Yeah, I mean,
and the way I put it was when there's a famine in the countryside, the king still eats like a king.
Yeah, so they sort of sidestep that problem entirely, of the idea of that consumption. If you were to eliminate half of the poorest 10% of the world, you wouldn't make a dent in consumption. That, if you were to eliminate, half of sub-Saharan Africa, which is millions and millions and millions of people, you would not be making any real dent at all in the actual consumption of goods or, material products, because the lowest income brackets don't consume much at all. They consume nearly nothing. And at the same time, if you were to the actual top 10% of income and wealth holders consume massive amounts of goods, wildly disproportionate to any sense of need, of course. So,
yeah, a big driving factor behind the reason that famines are what they are has not as much to do with an actual lack of resources, but more an inequality in ability to access and afford the resources which exist, which, if that barrier was removed, would, if not completely solve the issue, at least very strongly mitigate the damage that like crop failures and dust bowls and all that stuff cause.
Yeah. Very often, I'm not confident enough. I don't know enough to say never. Very often, famines are not an issue of underproduction. They're a problem of maldistribution of food. Right. One of my favorite economists, who's very influential, Amartya Sen, famously made the point that you effectively never see famines in functioning democracies throughout history, because the reason is that in a functioning democracy, different regions and different areas and different classes of people have mechanisms with which they can appeal for aid. And so even when they're in a famine, they can receive aid from any sort of central government that's responsive to their needs and thus avert a tragic famine. You only see famines in situations where these people cannot appeal for compensation for like regional lack of growth of crops, places where people can't appeal for help and appeal for a redistribution of food. So it's like, it just seems so, and I guess you should expect this from a Marvel movie, it's such a poorly thought out motivation in so many different ways.
Yeah, and then part of the problem, and part of my ultimate problem with how this is handled isn't so much that Thanos has this motivation, because I mean he's called the Mad Titan, so like motivation itself isn't necessarily a bad thing to have, but it's the way the movie frames it as Thanos is right about the problem, but his methods are wrong.
The Avengers never question his Malthusianism. They're never like, well, I don't know, is that empirically correct, what he's saying? They sort of just accept it. They're like, okay, yeah, sure, you're right. But they say, however, even though you are correct, and we're probably going to face massive famine and disease or whatever, it's wrong to make the choice to kill some people to save others. They don't.
Right. I think a key scene with that is when Thanos and Gamora are talking about because Thanos basically adopted Gamora after he like wiped out half of her species, and Thanos talks about his like motivations. He gives his standard little speech, and then he says, since his genocide of Gamora's people, things have been really good, and it's a paradise, and so when I do that to the rest of the universe, it'll be a paradise too. And to that, Gamora says, she screams like, "You don't know that," to the outcome of his methods, not the motivations themselves.
I think she said something like, but only by killing half of the people, or so, like that was her response, or part of her response. And it's like she wasn't questioning the idea. I don't remember her questioning the idea that it's a paradise now, or that things are good. She questions the cost of the mechanism through which he got there. So it doesn't call into question his Malthusianism. It calls into question his consequentialism, which is stupid, because Malthusianism is wrong and consequentialism is correct. And like there's another scene here, and there's a couple of scenes, and this pissed me off so much. It's one of my biggest complaints about the movie, where to try to keep this ethos alive of like, we don't trade lives. So one of the Infinity Stones that Thanos needs is implanted in the head of a cyborg superhero named Vision, who's one of the Avengers. And Vision says, well, to prevent this guy from being able to commit genocide, why don't we just kill me and destroy this stone, and then we could be sure that he can't ever do this. And they all, even though he was the one suggesting this, and even though he is correct, they all say, like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to trade lives. So effectively what they're saying is, we're not going to trade this one human being, or this one, cyborg life. He's a life. That's part of something they discuss. We're not going to trade this one life for trillions and trillions and trillions of lives to guarantee to save them. Because they think of another idea, they think of another plot extending idea where they could maybe take it out of him and then destroy it and save him or whatever. But it's this idea of like, we're not going to make these incredibly basic moral decisions where we're not going to kill this one person to guarantee the safety of trillions and trillions of people. Because that's morally wrong. Killing anyone in any case is wrong. Which is not the thing that you should be concerned. That's not what's the problem with Thanos' case. And it just drove me nuts that they weren't willing to acknowledge that actually his idea that you at a certain point need to trade lives whenever making tough moral decisions, that's not what he's wrong about. What he's wrong about is that you need to kill people to keep other people alive.
And the movie also frames like the idea of like just killing Vision to get rid of the Infinity Stone as being just the wrong choice by showing that it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, well, so
because
that's
Thanos
sort of
ultimately like
that's sort of a bullshit
time.
thing that they did because like theoretically like so yeah what happens in the end is that finally at the last minute Scarlet Witch decides that she is going to destroy Vision's stone in order to prevent him from getting it.
Yeah, look, very
literally
at the last minute, like Thanos is already walking towards them.
But it turns out, Thanos already has the time stone, so he could just rewind before she did that and then take it from him, and that's what he does. You could probably have avoided that at some point if you had like just taken Vision to a random location that Thanos would have had an incredibly hard time finding, and then done it there, and then he wouldn't have known what place or time he would have need to been. But, whatever, ignoring that. The point is that they set it up in such a way so that they can make this, so that they can make the moral lesson, killing anyone or, trading moral choices is wrong. Which is a dumb moral... It's such a dumb moral of the story because they are trading lives. It's the trolley problem. They aren't... By refusing to kill Vision and save these trillions of people... They aren't avoiding trading lives there. They are trading lives. They're trading Vision's life for the life of trillions of people. They're just doing it passively in such a way that they can make their hands seem clean. They are making a moral decision there.
Yeah,
and the whole movie is this idea that you can be passive.
The refusal to make that simple moral choice that Vision himself says we should do directly results in Thanos being able to finish the Infinity Gauntlet and snap his fingers and wipe out half of all life. And
the problem is that this wouldn't be that big of a thing if this were one time. This happens several times throughout the movie. And so, in another situation, Gamora knows the location of one of the stones, and she's refusing to give it to Thanos because she knows that doing it would allow him to kill trillions of people. But then she finds out that he has her sister, and he's torturing her, and she watches her be tortured for 20 seconds, and then she's like, okay, I'll become complicit in genocide because I don't like my sister being tortured. And it's that's the wrong choice. There is no excuse for making that.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. I know you love your sister, and love for family, that's of course an incredibly valid thing. But when it comes to that and being complicit in the largest genocide which could ever possibly be conducted, there's clearly a moral choice to be made there, and giving him the location of the stone is the wrong one. And they don't address that. They don't address that at all. The morals and the politics of this are just so incredibly messed up.
Yeah, there's several times where they could have just completely destroyed Thanos' plans if they just acted rationally and immediately. There's another scene where Peter Quill, who has agreed to kill his Gamora, who he's kind of his girlfriend. It's never really established what their relationship is beyond romantic. Beyond just a general romantic relationship. He's promised to kill her if Thanos gets a hold of her because she knows the location of the Soul Stone. And Thanos gets a hold of her, and Peter just stands there for for several minutes not doing anything, and it's presented as this moral like quandary for him, and ultimately when he does decide to pull the trigger on his gun, it's too late.
Yeah.
And if it acted quicker and more effectively, then the whole situation could have been avoided.
Yeah, and it comes down to sort of my problem with superheroes generally, which is that, like, okay, so the idea of the basic superhero idea is that these people have these incredible abilities which they could use to do great good and fight evil. You know, they have this great responsibility because they have this great power. But, like, if these people can't make these basic decisions, and some of these decisions were, you know, I mean, it might be tough to the individual, but, like, on a grand scale, very easy to make in terms of, like, dealing with the morality of the universe. If you can't make that decision, you shouldn't be entrusted with this sort of power. Like, we shouldn't let superheroes make these kinds of decisions if they're going to become complicit in mass genocide every time one of their family members is threatened. That's not a responsibility we should be giving these people. And it just points to the absurdity of what's going on here. That, like, this plot is just moral and ethical garbage. And it just points out so much wrong structurally with the superhero genre. I don't know. I'm just getting pissed off at this point.
Yeah, I feel like it's a good point that, like, the basic premise of what a superhero is that it's a very powerful person who has a responsibility to defend people who are weaker than them. And so and that's fine to a certain extent, but then when you get into these situations where they have to make a decision which is difficult for them as an individual, but would fulfill their responsibility that they have put upon themselves to do this defending of the weak, and they don't do it, then
what's the point?
First of all, you're kind of undermining the very point of what a superhero should be.
Yeah, it's not a good movie. I mean, that's, I guess, what we're trying to get at here. Politics is...
But you wanted to talk about like the implications of like the franchise and what it says. So, like,
I was going to get into that. We're at a half-hour point right now, so we already talked a lot about this. So I'll make it very brief, and then we'll try to move on. But one of the things that I think depressed me most about this movie is because not only the morals of it, but I came to realize how much in every way this movie was contrived. It was designed from the beginning to sell you tickets to part 2. There's like, and a lot of this comes down to the ending. So the ending is that Thanos, through the sheer incompetency of the Avengers, acquires all of the Infinity Stones. And then he makes the decision, and he snaps his fingers, and half of all life in the universe is wiped out. Weirdly enough, they don't show half of the destruction of all plant life. It's just people. But whatever, minor detail. Interestingly, so like half of all the superheroes get wiped out. Black Panther gone, Spider-Man gone, Guardians gone, so on. Interestingly, all 5 of the Avengers who had the biggest spot on the poster of the original Avengers movie survived. And I did the math on that. You do 0.5 to the 5th power, what are the odds of that happening? It's 3%. So this 3% chance happens where all of the most important characters in the Avengers series manage to survive this random event. And they've already established, we now know that if you have the Infinity Gauntlet, you could go back in time. So they established that right at the last minute before he does this, so we know what's going to happen. At a certain point in the next movie, at the end of the next movie, they're going to reacquire the gauntlet, probably, and then they're going to make some sacrifices, and then they're going to go back in time before he made that, like, the culling of all life, and then you're going to be back where you started, except they're probably going to get rid of, like, a few major characters whose contracts are expiring. And that's it.
Yeah.
And then they're going to get another couple of... They're going to get another $500 billion, or, you know... They're going to get another couple $1 billion in merchandise and in licensing and in ticket sales, and then it'll all be over. And who cares? That, like, when you know that this is all just for profit, when you know that there's no real care about the story anymore, and that it's just, like, contrived entertainment for the purpose of acquiring capital, who cares?
Hmm. I mean, not to get like pretentious, but I just the quote from Macbeth just keeps running in my mind. You know, like it's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying
Yeah,
nothing.
honestly, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's
And it's just this huge spectacle, and like there's the scene where everyone dies just drags on.
so yeah, so you get this
Uh,
tear jerk moment for like each of your favorite characters dying, and like they have this whole thing for some reason. Peter Parker, his death takes way longer than all the other characters. Where like the rest of them fade in like 5 seconds, and like it takes Peter Parker like 30 seconds to fade away, so that Iron Man can hold him in his arms and he could cry. And he says, "I don't want to go away." And you know that you're supposed to be like, this is supposed to be a tearjerker moment, and you're like, this is so meticulously planned. Like this is so cynical of them, and I don't care about it because I know Peter Parker's not dead.
Yeah, you can just see the
Yeah.
board meeting, like where they just decided which
And I
characters
know
are
Peter
going to
Parker's
die.
not dead because I know you have another Spider-Man movie planned. Like it's
And you have another
yeah.
Guardians
And
movie
there's another
planned.
there's another Black Panther. It's like I know these characters are not dead. This is emotionally meaningless.
And everyone has been confirmed to return for the sequel, so you know everyone's
Yeah.
going to come back to life. It's
Just-
meaningless.
It's a cash grab. It's the point at which, and up to this point, Marvel's done a good job of, and this is what I said in my review. Up to this point, Marvel's done a good job of making movies which are profitable yet quality. Movies which are, enjoyable. They are not bad movies, but they are still extremely lucrative. This is the point where Marvel's gone to cash grab. This is a cash grab movie.
Yeah.
I would not recommend it. I mean, if you love this movie, if you love Avengers, if you love the Marvel Universe, go see it. Otherwise, it's not worth it.
And I feel I should emphasize there were a lot of things that I did enjoy about it. There were there were several very good character moments, and the action scenes were lovely. But like overall, the ethos of what the movie is and what it means for like just the industry in general just leaves a completely foul taste in my mouth.
There's something, and I guess this is the note I'll close on. There's something Red Letter Media said that's sort of been haunting my dreams, which is this idea that like the way that so many things, so many independent movies are now going online or streaming or only getting small releases, we might witness at some point, like in a decade or so, movie theaters are just going to be Avengers and Mission Impossible viewing arenas. And if you want to see any sort of movie that's like a writer director, someone who put like their passion into creating a movie, or some independent piece that's really pushing the boundaries of film, or just some like independent piece that just has a creative idea and is trying to do it without a big budget, you're not going to be able to go to those in theaters anymore because theaters are being redesigned now to be these high-priced places, and you're just going to go there to watch these enormous spectacles with no meaning to them. And if you want to watch anything else, you got to go somewhere else. And this is that's like an apocalyptic version of what's going to actually happen. It's not going to be that extreme, but this is
it's very very similar to what the theaters were in like Brave New World.
Yeah. So but this is not a good sign in terms of avoiding that fate. Anyways, so that's my concluding note.
Right, and our other topic for today is a bit of a hornet's nest, which we have ill-advisedly decided to
I cannot
step
believe
in.
we spent 40 minutes on the Avengers, and we're going to spend 20 minutes on Israel and Palestine. We have become everything we hated.
Yes, that is our topic. The conflict between the state of Israel and Palestine, the government, the people, the culture, and basically everything, which has really, there's been some really horrible developments in just the last couple of weeks, especially as the United States moves its embassy to Jerusalem and recognizes Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel.
Yeah. So I'm not. Should we start from the beginning? All right. Well, let's start from most recently. What's happened that's brought this into the news once more is that a number of Palestinian activists have organized what they call a Great March of Return, and it has a number of purposes: lifting the blockade on the Gaza Strip, which sort of chokes it off of a lot of required materials that it needs. Basic stuff even for construction or medicine and things like that. And then also for advocating for the right of return, which is sort of the ultimate goal, the highest goal of a lot of Palestinian activists, which is that those who were expelled from Israel, the Arabs who were expelled from Israel, should be allowed to return to their property that's still in Israel, that was acquired by Israelis. And then it's also, of course, lined up in such a way so as to protest the moving of the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is a very large, very important symbolic move on the United States' part in favor of the Israeli government and away from any sort of peace process. And in response to this, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have responded incredibly brutally. Right now, the number that I'm looking at on Wikipedia as of a couple of days ago was 111 dead and 12,000 injured on the Palestinian side. And on the Israeli side, 1 slightly wounded. Which it feels like as time goes on, these numbers are getting more and more ridiculous in terms of how disproportionately violence is afflicted. Like this, you can't call this a war anymore.
Yes. It's just...
This is a slaughter. This is a slaughter of a people. And calling it... I'm not going to get into the idea of... Because it's a tricky legal question more than a moral question of whether this would qualify as genocide or something like that. I'm not going to get into that because it's a very much a legal construct. But there's just been this incredibly disgusting escalation of violence against Palestinian activists. By the Israeli state, and it seems like everything that's going on in the past couple of years, so Donald Trump's new just unequivocally pro-Israeli stance as opposed to the more temperate but ultimately pro-Israeli stance of the Barack Obama and previous administrations, and then the hard turn right in Israeli politics in recent years, and the rapidly declining living standards in the Gaza Strip, it seems like we're leaving any chance of a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah. I'm reminded, just in general, the sort of shift, this sort of rightward shift, just in both in Israeli politics and just just popular culture, the most popular, I think it's the most popular football club in Israel, Beitar Jerusalem, renamed itself Beitar Trump Jerusalem Football Club in honor of the move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
I hadn't heard that.
And it's just
great. It's really awesome.
It's just horrible. I think I'm trying to remember exactly how old she was, but the other day, an 8-month-old baby was killed after inhaling tear gas in her family's home from this just
I think.
Slaughter.
Wait a sec.
And it's just horrible.
I think I heard something about that in that particular case it was I can't find it now. I believe that it was found. All right. Well, I'm not going to say this with any confidence. I've heard the idea. I've heard contested claims about that particular incident. Is what I'm trying to get at. I've heard some people say that the baby actually had pre-existing medical conditions which led to its death, and then I've heard others say that it was tear gas, and I'm not sure which is correct. But that particular incident aside, it is the confirmed incidents of violence against Palestinians without discrimination, for children or, for people typically protected under rules of war, has just been growing to become unbelievably overt. even at the same time as, the Netanyahu administration is now increasing the number of Israeli settlements in the West Bank in violation of international law. And with the emergence of Trump, the United States government has stopped even pretending to be upset about that. And then with conditions in the Gaza Strip growing essentially unlivable, and the UN released... by
2020.
The UN famously released a report.
An acute,
the UN famously
crisis.
released a report in 2012 saying that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. And they released a report quite recently, or like in 2017, I believe, saying that it's on its way there. Nothing's changed. It's becoming one of the worst places on Earth in terms of living conditions. It seems like there's the hope of a peaceful resolution very quickly being extinguished here.
Yeah, the term I keep hearing used over and over for Gaza is just, it's an open-air prison. And that's just basically how it is. There's only power for a couple hours each day, if that. There's guards all along, all over. There's planes and drones overhead constantly. And it's just like who could possibly blame anyone for fighting against that? And in what universe could anyone possibly be in the wrong for resisting that?
So this is where it comes to a particularly thorny area, and this issue ties into these particular protests that have been catching attention over the past month. The protests were set up by independent activists in Gaza, but they were endorsed, and I'm reading off of Wikipedia here because this is what I use to get background a lot for these conversations. Endorsed and supported is the quote they use by Hamas, and the Israeli state has used that as an excuse to say that these are Hamas organized protests, and for that reason,
and then the protesters are like
yeah, exactly, militants. And for that reason, the laws of war apply here, and the Israeli state can just open fire on protesters, and it's this idea that like any resistance against Israel is tied with these sort of like these very anti-Semitic, very radical Islamist strains of ideology. The idea is that the only reason you could ever attack Israel is if you hate the Jewish people, or if you're fine with Iran destroying the Middle East, or all these other ideas. They're these constructs that are made to divert any sort of actual outrage at the actions of the government of Israel in such a way to make them appear illegitimate by associating them with hateful ideology or with terrorism or with extremist ideology.
And then the media in the U.S. is
absolutely
complicit in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This idea.
And
like I've seen like even like somewhat more reputable news sources like the New York Times and the Post and all those sorts of institutions describe protesters as like Hamas militants, and describe what's going on as clashes where death tolls rise. Very, very
There's been a whole lot of attention paid to that recently, and I haven't read his piece yet, but Adam Johnson is a journalist who does a lot of really good work on... wait, let me find the piece, actually. He does a lot of work for FAIR, which is a progressive media criticism outlet, and he's pointed out a lot recently about the language that we use. And this isn't just him. A lot of journalists and activists have been pointing this out. The language used whenever it comes to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the way that it's even referred to, like he points out, he puts it in scare quotes, even referred to as a conflict at this point, as opposed to a slaughter and a resistance.
Yeah.
And the way that we talk about that all headlines, and this is maybe because of journalistic liability, I don't know, the way that headlines don't talk about them being killed, it talks about them being like shot or dying, to remove the idea of an active participant in their death. To remove the idea that they are not dying, they are being killed.
Yeah, and and you can see a very very clear distinction between the way that these sorts of things are talked about with regards to Israel, and how they'd be talked about, for example, with someone that the U.S. isn't friendly with, like Russia or Cuba or Korea or North Korea. I mean, or China. And that's not to. I'm not trying to downplay like the seriousness of things that those governments do to their civilians. There's just a very clear difference in how it's talked about. Like I guarantee you, if this sort of thing was being done by the Cuban government against Cuban people, they would not be using this sort of passive language.
We would have troops in Cuba right now if this were being done by the Cuban government to the Cuban people. And again, because it's so easy for anyone to accuse us of this. This is not dismissing the human rights violations of any of these countries, which are very real. This is pointing out the fact that the United States is openly complicit in these wild human rights violations. So much so that as this was happening, Donald Trump and a bunch of other United States dignitaries were in Jerusalem at the celebration of the opening of our new embassy there. When it was, Israel's in a large country. It was a couple hours drive away at most. These just open shooting of political activists. And it's just incredible the extent to which this isn't recognized in more mainstream circles by politicians, by media, whatsoever. The idea that the special relationship that the United States has with Israel and the unique history there and the interest groups being played, it makes it so that we can't talk about Israel in accurate terms. We have to bend over backwards to make sure that we're not accurately representing what the Israeli government is doing, because they're a close ally, or if, depending on who you ask, they're the next chance of Jesus Christ coming. There's a whole bunch of different interests in Israel that make it so that criticism of it is basically banished from mainstream popular discourse.
And it's frustrating because I remember, at least during the Bush years, there was still sort of this, even within liberal circles, there was this sentiment of Palestinians having the right to self-determination, and criticism, even if it was mild, of the Israeli government and its policies. And then after Obama came in, and even to the present day, even with Trump, it's just gone completely. Even from within from within even liberal circles.
It doesn't make any sense ideologically, because I don't think this is any way a radical, to take the stance of even at the minimum sympathy with the Palestinian people and what they're going through. I don't think that's a position that requires radical politics. It's it's just a consistent application of even a basic liberal human rights framework would have you arrive at that conclusion. And from an international politics perspective, there's no realist case to make for why we support Israel the way we do. The benefits of doing that for United States foreign policy, you could easily make the case, are smaller smaller than the costs. This isn't...
I would argue that in general, the U.S.'s unquestioning support for Israel is detrimental to its position on the international stage.
If you ask, there's been polling done, I think it was by Gallup a number of years back, about polling people across the Middle East, citizens across the Middle East, about what their greatest issue is with United States policy. Consistently, one of the greatest ones is its unwavering support for Israel. It complicates our Middle Eastern affairs significantly, and we spend billions of dollars of aid there every year. And of course, there are military and strategic benefits to what we're doing there. But you could very easily make the costs that they're outweighed by the costs. Make the case they're outweighed by the costs. My point is that you don't need to be a Hamas Islamist militant or some Marxist-Leninist whatever to make this case. I think that this should be something that should be pretty easy for people to arrive at. But because of all the U.S. interests that are wrapped up with our relationship with Israel, and because of a lot of complicated politics, it's become impossible to even... It's incredibly difficult to even make a case for why Israel was wrong here.
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't, and even with everything that's been happening, I really don't see that changing. I think liberals are still too tied up in their Russia fantasies to really be able to see the forest for the trees.
You mean like they're...
Like I've already seen I live in Austin, Texas, so I'm unfortunately very much surrounded by the sorts of liberal Democrats that sort of say these sorts of things, and I've already seen some of them talk about how they think that Russia might be somehow behind these protests to sort of disrupt the U.S.'s ability to act on a global stage and stuff like that.
Yeah. I haven't seen much center-left attention on this whatsoever, in any capacity at all. And I don't want to say that it's entirely because we've just become desensitized to this kind of thing, although I think that's probably a big part of it. The idea that this sort of violence has just been normalized at this point. But it just frustrates me to no end that this is seen as such a out there opinion to be concerned about this issue. And I would like to see some center... I mean, I know it's not going to happen realistically because all the political incentives, even if you are sympathetic with Israel, or I mean, even if you are sympathetic with Palestine, all your political incentives are to, at most, come out in favor of a two-state solution and do the both sides thing. Mm-hmm. But I just wish this would enter the discourse. I wish we could have an honest conversation about the human rights implications of what's happening here, the foreign policy implications of what's happening here, without someone instantly reacting to any sort of criticism of Israel with saying, oh, so you support Hamas then. As though the only two possible sides that you could support here are a terrorist organization and an incredibly violent military occupation, when they're not. This isn't a two-sided thing here. There's countless sides to this issue, and it's I don't know. It's just frustrating the way that the rhetoric around this issue has been constructed.
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a depressing note to end on, but I mean, this is still ongoing, and I guess I kind of have to hold out hope that just these incredibly just awful and just piercing images and videos and just footage that's still coming out of the area, even today. I have to hold out hope that people will sort of wake up and be able to say this isn't right. We need to stop propping up and being complicit in letting this happen.
It
won't happen, but I have to.
I don't know what the resolution to this is going forward from here.
If we could solve the
if we could solve the Israeli Palestinian conflict in this podcast,
we would not be set for life.
I don't know what the resolution is. I guess the resolution is just find activist groups who are honest in their concern and their sympathies with the Palestinian people and with the need for peace. And there are groups like this within Israel that are doing fantastic work. There's a lot of Jewish peace groups that are doing fantastic work on this. Find groups that are find groups and people and activists that are genuinely dedicated to peace in Israel and Palestine, to a resolution of this issue, to justice for the Palestinian people, who don't fall into many of the traps that a lot of the worst of sometimes you'll see in anti-Israeli movements, that don't fall into anti-Semitism, that don't fall into support for Hamas or Hezbollah. Find people who have sympathies for the Palestinian people and who have interest in a peaceful resolution, and see what you can to support their work, I guess, would be my only suggestion. Because at a high political level, I don't see anything happening about this in the near future. Yeah. So that's depressing, but I mean,
incentive.
Just don't give up hope. As hard as it is, and that's a resolution we come to a lot. As hard as it is, you just got to have hope that this is not the end of it.
Yeah, and I feel like by way of concluding, I feel like I should state that and I feel like I can speak for you on this issue, that from both of us, that we send all of our support and solidarity with the Palestinian people and their struggle and with their fight for their rights and for their freedoms, and that we hope that one day we will be able to look back and see this time as the time that came before the fight was won.
And as an additional side note, also solidarity with all of the peace activists in Israel who are resisting the Netanyahu government and who are organizing for a peaceful resolution. Because if there is going to be something that comes about here, I think it's going to have to be something where there are forces in both Israel and Palestine who are calling for an end to Israeli occupation. So just peace to solidarity with those who are attempting that end goal. And that's the conversation for us, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, that was fun.
All right. So if you'd like to sign off.
Thank you all for listening again. Hopefully we'll be doing these more regularly again now. You've been listening to Left and Lefter. I'm Brett, and I'm Left.
I'm Alice, and I'm Lefter. We'll see you soon.
Oh, a song will lift as the mainsail shifts and the boat drifts on to the shoreline. And the sun will respect every face on the deck the hour that the ship comes in. And the sands will roll out a carpet of gold for your weary toes to be a-touching. And the ship's wise men will remind you once again that the whole wide world is one.